Hello everyone, today we talk about the Cluniac reform and the literary dimension of the Cluniac environment at the times of Odo of Cluny, that was the greater promoter, or at least the greater factual reformer of the Cluniac reform. So, in the period of glory of Cluny itself. And I decided to talk about the literary aspects of this because they can be very meaningful as a tool to understand much of the Cluniac environment as well as the one of the lay world within which this was more broadly framed, and especially stressing the relations that existed, very strong ties existing between the Cluniac monasticism and lay aristocracy. That is definitely reflected by, as we will be seeing in certain works. And I don't think that the Cluniac reform has to be introduced. The Cluniac reform was essentially, however, very shortly, the reformation of the say the application of Benedictine Rule, because indeed the Benedictine Rule was one and only one, so it couldn't be reformed, but there could be different approaches, especially because at that time in Western Europe the Benedictine Rule was the only one. All the monks in Western Europe considered themselves as Benedictines, and they approached the same 6th century work of Saint Benedict, and this obviously had brought in turn, however, to certain differentiations within. Think about this huge European dimension at this point, and you can easily imagine that there would be different interpretations according to the local traditions that the communities had decided to found. There was, incidentally, since we were talking about literary aspects as well, a sharp differences in intellectual skills within certain areas of Europe. And the Cluniac reform arrives, telling the truth, at the end of the Carolingian world in many ways, and in this sense, it's interesting because through its reformation, the Cluniac reform wanted to step even beyond the strictly monastic uh, borders. The so-called claustrum. It wanted to to embody, to epitomize, as it had always been, telling the truth, the aims of monasticism, the perfection of the world, the perfection of a monastic community that lived according to God's rule and in his contemplation. But it also wanted to essentially inspire the rest of the world through his example, and and we will see how. So the Cluniac reform at this point is happening in a very different Europe from the one that the rule of Saint Benedict had initially spread. Not just because at this time, at least Western Europe is almost completely Christianized formally, but also because the Carolingian structures had left, in spite of the end of the empire, had left a substantial transformation into the very tissue of the Western European world. There were aristocracies spreading at a local level, building up very ferocious and competitive domains that, although small, were progressively extending, and the same founding of monasteries and their general the general protection and therefore control that noble families had over them was definitely one of the main tools that were in the political hands, in the hands of politics, say better, of that time, meaning that building a monastery wasn't just about, let's send a bunch of guys praying for our family, but it was actually an investment, something that could extend your power and the one of your family into local communities, into a large environment, and it was a pretty sound investment for that time, especially in a Europe that was largely completely, I'd say, agrarian, and there had been, after the Carolingian Empire, a new contraction of monetary goods. The second invasions arrived, so investing in land and in a monastery, maybe even isolated from the great routes, was something that was largely feasible, because the rural world was definitely the privileged area at that time for expansion of the noble interests. And one of the main consequences of this, as it's very well known, is that the abbots of the monasteries, were largely coming from noble families, were usually the the second-born sons of lords who were entrusted the direction of the abbey or monastery that was, in this sense, very strongly tied to the original family. It would happen, by the way, that families, split up into various branches. They can decay. Life at that time for a feudal lord would be also quite risky in terms of warfare, etc. So it would happen that even the relations between the monastery and the family would die out at a point, and that these monasteries would emancipate themselves and carry out feudal political and military even policies. But generally speaking, there was always the idea that the guys who were at the top of these seigneuries, of these lordships, were aristocrats in some form, and this meant that for those time standards, they were likely to have a pretty good education, especially if you had been. I mean, it's not that feudal families had an excessive, an excessive level of education. On the contrary, they were pretty much ignorant. But definitely, the church was, on average, more educated, and the son of a lord who was meant by his father to become an abbot of the family, a monastery would indeed be schooled, or at least educated, since he was a child, towards that direction. By the way, these produce sometimes certain certain strange conditions that happen many times, of cadet sons that were meant to become clergy, and instead, because maybe the firstborn male had died, the heir had died, they would be taken out literally from monasteries and start, living in the secular way, being strongly influenced by the ecclesiastical experience. So we can think, maybe with this premise, of all the options that even what we will be seeing here in the literary field could be contemplated, and their actual meaning. Naturally, the form of education that abbots would have, and that in the Cluniac world had so much importance, was definitely an edifying moral perspective, because naturally there had to be an adherence to the monastic traditions, to the Christian values, and obviously couldn't really be otherwise. And this in turn naturally influenced the literary production of these abbots, who who wrote, because in fact we've seen they were educated, they had access into monasteries at this time to considerable amount of manuscripts. In the early Middle Ages, the Benedictine monasteries wouldn't really have libraries as such. They would have maybe a closet in which they were put, I don't know, the some Benedict's rules, some commentary of a father of the church, but they kept themselves together with the tools for working the land or stuff like that. It's just at this point that the feudal society is able to produce even a monastic elite that was fed by other people, working class people, and that could dedicate also to not just to pure spiritual contemplation, but also to the learning of obviously of works that obviously still belong to the Christian dimension, but that definitely wide the horizons and the curiosity of these characters and definitely their cultural prestige. So, of extreme importance in this picture are the works of the abbot Odo of Cluny. Now, Odo of Cluny is largely remembered as the great Cluniac reformer. He was the second abbot of Cluny. Cluny had been founded by by the Duke of Aquitaine at the beginning of the 10th century in a region that is really Burgundy and the French Comte county, and so even consider here the geographical landscape of the thing. For a duke in Aquitaine founding a monastery into Burgundy, that is from west to eastern France, because that tells you how certain aristocracies would be would have such a long range of power to extend their foundations and pious foundations even in such a faraway land. And Cluny would be first. The first abbot of Cluny was actually Bernard, who was master of also of Odo, but Odo is definitely the most important figure of Cluny in this sense, and he left us a lot of works that are extremely prizable for those times, and that give to us a pretty good understanding of the mindset of an abbot of those times. Obviously, the Cluniac perspective, etc., but also many other interesting elements about the secular dimension and the lay world, and especially how the monastic thought perceived the lay world at that time and what it expected in a certain sense to have from it. In Otto's work, there is definitely an insistence, not surprisingly, of the presence of a sort of a rampant perversity that was within the world of those times. That was contraposed to a particular kind of people, a particular lineage, we can say, not casually, of good people. Of good people meant obviously in the Christian fashion. Now, first of all, let's briefly reflect on this. I mean, why such a view? We recalled that this was not a really great political moment in Europe, at least. It was a moment of great disorder because there was no central authority. Here we are in that in that sort of limbo that that existed between the Carolingian Europe and the Ottonian one. So there was no strong centralized authority. Aristocracies were largely free to carry out all their um, expansionistic policies, and there was obviously the sense that this was a problem not just for the actual life of people, but also in a Christian perspective, because naturally um, the church was meant to, at that time, to have a guide in the secular rulers. You know, the concepts of the Gregorian reform were still relatively far to be formulated, and in the bigger picture, with the second invasions of Normans, Hungars, and Saracens, and so on, there was definitely the feeling that the end of the world was near, and that there was an evil, an inherent evil of mankind that was kind of even rising into this chaotic picture. So the stock of the good, the stock of those who were called, according to Odo, viri spirituales, that means um, spiritual men, and viri perfecti, that means perfect men. Now, when we say vir, plural viri in Latin, we're actually not meaning just the human, which is homo in Latin. Vir is actually the virtuous man. In fact, virtue comes exactly from vir. And the ecclesiastical vocabulary had inherited this classical word to define, obviously, the vir not as in the Roman sense that stressed other forms of virtues that belong to a completely different cultural paradigma, but from a Christian point of view. So the good Christian was, in this sense, a vir, so kind of a virtuous man from a Christian point of view. Um, and um, and what is well, we'll arrive to this. Um, I mean, who are really these viri spirituales or viri perfecti in the world? Well, first of all, they're usually those people free from um, carnal desires. So they are kind of chaste individuals. Chaste meant really even from the sexual point of view, because they were considering that telling the truth, at this time chastity wasn't really something imposed, not even in the clergy, and it wouldn't remain for a long time. Actually, it's only with the Gregorian reform that the old idea that carnal desires were kind of distracting the clergyman from the research of perfection, and especially in the monastic case that had to kind of radicalize that lifestyle. But at this time, however, it was still present since the beginning of Christian life, the idea that, yeah, mm, carnal pleasures are not seen as a very good thing, because all you have to think about is God, and yeah, you can have children, even a wife, but if you are a bishop or an abbot and you have such relations, you're probably not gonna be the perfect guy, because you're distracted by it. So in this sense, the Cluniac reform was a bit more oriented towards the rigidity of customs, and it's no surprise that chastity was emphasized as a sort of main characteristics of these special individuals. So obviously chaste were the monks that had this rule of obviously not having carnal relations and living in an organized community that had to check that. And by the local rules of monasteries, telling the truth, we know that there were problems relatively to this, because there would be sexual relations within the monastic walls, and this happens in all communities that are forcibly put together, and even certain monosexual communities like these were. So homosexuality would be more spread than in other communities, and from the actual rules of these monasteries, we know that there were quite strict um, ways to at least try to prevent that, like dividing all the various places where people slept, and it was naturally, now I don't want to get critical of it excessively, but it's obvious that there's always been a great hypocrisy around such ideals. The same Cluniac reform at a point, aside now from the sexual sphere, but in generally speaking, the same Gregorian reform occurred because the Cluniac monasticism was seen as a sort of very heartly experience, because these people would grow extremely aristocratic in lifestyle. Even inside monasteries, there was a huge ingerence of noblemen in the appointments of abbots, etc. So there was also great wealth that these monastic centers accumulated, and you can say that in certain excesses, Cluniac monks at a point would kind of continue their former secular life as aristocrats within the monastic walls. So you can imagine that even in Christian terms, we are all supposed to be sinners, and it would be strange if we weren't. So there was obviously an ideal direction, and then people acting at different degrees of obedience in this sense, and there was, however, and this is what I want to stress today, the idea that the viri spirituales et perfecti could exist not just within the monastic walls, but also in the secular world. This is extremely fascinating because, as I was saying before, the monastical ideal was theoretically imitative. The monks had to be isolated from the rest of the community in some measure, but they would still be in the world, and they had to be necessarily seen by the rest of the world, in the way they lived, because that was meant to be inspirational for following that model. So the monastic ambition was theoretically to make of the whole world a monastery. There was this idea that abandoning the seculum, you would enter into a completely privileged dimension that had nothing to do with the rest of the world, and that because it meant to make you closer to God, and in a dimension and in a form of collective community that basically could substitute the same world. The Benedictine Rule, let's remember, it was also about not just praying but also working. So it was theoretically believed that such communities could be self-sufficient. And this was true in the early days of the Benedictine world, where these monks really lived out of what they found. They started working the land on their own. In Cluniac times, things were much more different, because there would be a completely different form of organization, or at least it was fastly accelerating towards a sort of feudal model transposed into the same um, into the monastic dimension. So with people working for the monks, etc., and monasteries making politics and waging war, etc. However, it's extremely beautiful at this point that in Odo's work that seculum and monastic life, although divided, could still produce both perfect men from a spiritual point of view. What does that mean? It means, why is it astonishing? Because it was thought in a monastic perspective that the secular dimension was incompatible with a pious life. And this had been also a great reason of pride for monks. So why did things change? Well, things changed, and we will be seeing here, essentially because the Cluniac abbots were trying to bring glory and acceptance towards a certain type of lifestyle from which they came from, that was followed by their families of origin, with whom they kept having strong ties, and therefore it wasn't just an ideological point, but it was a very important political tool to sanctify certain figures of their own social milieu, and obviously conferring prestige to their families of origin. So the there is a bright example in a work of Aurillac that is called Vita Sancti Geraldi. That means in Latin the life of Saint Gerald or Gerald. I don't know how you want to call that. Gerald was a French aristocrat. He was nominated count at a point, but that came really later in his life, and it was something mediated by the church and his spiritual fame. He was from Auvergne, which is a region in central southern France, that had been famous for his pious lifestyle, albeit being an aristocrat. That means a feudal lord, a lord on his own, so conducting a perfectly lay life, carrying the swords, but not, however, being so intelligent and sane not to shed blood in order to solve problems. That was chaste, incidentally, because in this Vita Geraldi, obviously, the Odo sort of made this character famous, because we have a whole work written about him, and we don't have about most of the rest of the French aristocracy of the time. So, and the virtues of this guy were magnified. He had lived, by the way, shortly before, so he was a person that belonged to that world. He lived between the second half of the 9th and the first half of the 10th century. He was more of he had been living in the last Carolingian days, so he was still even part of that world that in turn had been glorified by the later Cluniac world, in the sense that obviously the Carolingian dynasty had been a point of reference already at that time, historically speaking, for the supposed virtues of the Carolingian rulers, at least of Charles the Great, who was conceived in legend as a sort of living saint by the Europeans in many ways, and definitely clergymen had a role in drawing this picture. because it was thought to be an imperial model wanted by God. So even having been part of that last days would confer a sort of aura of a touch that really was meant to stress that Gerald had belonged to that lay world, and he had remained fundamentally a layman into that world. Um, and there are many stories about this guy, like that once I don't remember really because I haven't read the work, but I have heard of it sometimes, and that I don't know, one evening he got, I don't know if he got lost or something, and he entered into the hut um, of a peasant or a rusticus, I don't remember, and he had spent the night watching the very very beautiful daughter of this man, um, and um, and he was very much in love with her immediately, and he was tempted by having her also because he was a lord. So you have to imagine that lords at that time raped, and you know, if they saw a very good looking peasant woman, they wouldn't think twice about using violence towards her in a world with no centralized authority, with a very great contempt for human life. So it was very meaningful in the story at that time there would be such an attitude, and he refuses. He remains chaste in this perspective, and he comes back to the hut one day, and he gives a dowry to this girl for marrying with obviously another man. And sometimes I don't know. I think these are these sound like very simple stories, you know. But imagining what it meant in those times, even for especially a monastic perspective of a person who maybe entered the monastery because he was son of aristocrats. It was actually a good opportunity on those times, because in monasteries you were fed, you lived within stone walls, which wasn't few considering the dangers of what happened in and around. So you kind of were a privileged person for those time standards, and yet the absence of a woman. Think about, you know, if you liked women, like I think it was normal for the average of the majority of the people who entered into these institutions at that time. Think of what it meant to accept the renunciation of earthly pleasures, and what it meant even for Odo himself, who was eventually made saint, to like a girl. I mean, in this work, and not having her, and freely deciding to refuse her. Obviously, this is a typical, you know, virtue that was in fact emphasized in Christian perspective here. But think of what it really meant for these individuals. Sometimes we, you know, even in our secular and modern world, we remember a girl and we say, oh my God, how beautiful she was. If I only could see her again. And think about these men who basically were voted to not to have a woman for all their lives. So think of the horizons, the perspectives, the sensibilities, the beliefs, and the great tensions that existed behind this, because it was an otherwise very miserable world. I mean, life was, you know, people died, there was a very high mortality, life wasn't that long after all. Maybe the monks were the guys who in fact lived the longest. And think of the solitude of this world. Think about loving someone and seeing her dead after, you know, a short while, all the illnesses that existed at those times. So in a very in many ways such a delicate world that jars sometimes with the extreme violence and brutality that coexisted very often at this point. You know, if you didn't enter into monastery, you probably went to become a warrior, a knight. Knighthood was being formed at this point, You had to slaughter people to fight all the time, to stay all the time on horseback. That was also demanding, that was also privation. And think about how this civilization produced such an astonishing contrast between an extreme brutality and an extreme sensibility and extreme delicacy. Um, I always found it very fascinating. Forgive me, forgive me for the digression. Um, and the um, I was reading here other things I prepared. Um, however, it doesn't matter here now. And what I wanted to talk about is, however, that figure of Gerald, sorry, Geraldus in Latin, was perfect in his mm, virginity, in his integrity, let's call it this way, but also because he was a quite mm, mild man. You know, what is stressed in the Vita Sancti Geraldi is the humility and the austerity of this lay lord. Even if he was wealthy and powerful, um, and it was also quite energetic under one point of view, that was mostly the protection and the exercise of justice. That was one of the prerogatives of the aristocracy, of the manorial system, of how it was developing within society. So he was. What is important to stress here is that he was a fully layman. It wasn't an halfway between, yeah, this guy was a lay, he had a normal life like a layman, and then he converts and enters the monastery. No, he remains a layman. This is the peculiarity of this world. Um, and he carried out his life, his lay life, as a perfectly pure person. That is what really Odo wanted to say. That there are people, even in the aristocracy, so in the in the level of society that was more prone to temptations, to corruption, to any form of sin, for the same for just the sheer amount of difficulties and irresponsibilities that it implied, and then instead was seen as potentially still a saint, a class that could emanate holy figures that could coexist within it. So the um, the you have to think. I think now that you're listening to me, you're probably wondering, but what the hell do I care about this? I mean, what's extraordinary in this? And to me, it seems like, yeah, it could be. I don't see the big deal. And telling the truth, it is a big deal for the mindset of those times, because up to that time, the monastic literary production had constantly had been constantly aimed um, at being read by other monks, or at least clergymen. So people who lived into the ecclesiastical world proper, not in the secular one. Here, Odo, for the first time, dared, because that's the point, that nobody before that point had ever dared to do something like that, to tell the life and the miracles of a layman. That is what monks had genetically, we can say, from a monastic point of view, always refused as a model of lifestyle. So this is really what is so singular of this, and how courageous and how revealing of that society Otto's work really is. And yet, you don't have to make it so simple, because what Odo was doing was not really celebrating the lay aristocracy. On the contrary, he didn't get out of that pattern. He was still stressing that the rest of the aristocracy was made up of extremely brutal, sinful people who obviously were all but a model of a righteous Christian behavior, obviously. But what is remarkable is that he was trying to say that a part of monastic life could coexist within the layman, a part even of the same monastic identity in many ways. How? Because the Gerald in the work is not really fully he is fully a layman, but he's also partly monk. For instance, one thing just to make you understand, he had a tonsure, and that was obviously proper of the monks. And you'd say also here, but yeah, what is wrong? It is wrong that at this point of the feudal world, there were quite strong, let's say, earthly ethics that belonged sometimes even to the Germanic pagan ethos that had survived in spite of the Christianization. So especially within the aristocracy, think about also those aristocracies living, I don't know, in the newly Christianized lands of Saxony, but even the same Carolingians were that Christianized as we might think. It was sometimes, their Christianization would be very superficial. They had still very contractualistic views regarding God. They didn't understand religion. Let's be honest with that. They didn't read. They didn't understand theology. They were essentially told to believe a certain thing, and then that was it. And for the rest, they would still largely live more, more influenced by their warlike ethos than the Christian morality. So among the various things that were prized in the aristocracy were certain physical characteristics, and one of these was of typical Germanic origin, and was the idea that first of all, the warrior had to be beautiful. I mean, the concept is that you were ugly, you were inferior. We're at the limit really of eugenetics at this point. There was really sort of proto-racism that it was developing also in some fashion, in the sense that maybe the idea of having noble blood compared to the one of the peasants that usually were serfs because they had been conquered by the warriors that was stronger even physically. There were all these kind of very bully attitudes that stressed the beauty of the warriors, of the lords. And one of the main characteristics was having extremely long, fluent, and beautiful hair, which is typical of German epics. If you read the pagan, if you read the sagas of pre-Christianized Germans, the idea that the strength of a warrior also laid in his hair is something that happens there, and this is something that survives, telling the truth, very long in the European chivalric tradition. Even the Slavs had this the idea that warrior had to have very long hair. So here's the paradox. What did Gerald do? He was definitely inspired and attracted by monastic life, so he got himself tonsured. But I find it even funny in many ways. He wore a wig. He wore a wig in front of whom? In front of the subjects, in front of the community, because it was still believed in Odo's mind, not in Gerald's mind, that we don't know, because we don't know, but in Odo's mind, that in front of society you had to act as a layman. So here, and yet you could still be tonsured and have certain monastic practices in here. So you're kind of fake. You're kind of lying to people. Gerald was like clopping around with his horse in front of his peasants, in front of the other lords with this long hair that were in reality a wig, because what he really mattered is, however, it was to be tonsured behind under the wig. Yet, understanding that it was important for that society to be seen as a as a as a strong man with this beautiful hair that stress his authority and attractiveness, and evidently kind of kind of instilled security and pride in the community to have a lord like that. So it's pretty bizarre in our terms, in our modern perspective, but so it wasn't, because it proves that that in a certain sense the lay world and the monastic one and ecclesiastical one can go together and have to go together. And it's as if they were part even of a same system, because in here the monastery is not just something that lives on its own. It's able even to enter in a sort of fashionable lifestyle into the aristocracy, and they're both operating in the same person of Gerald for spiritual reasons and for mundane reasons that are however conceived as compatible with difficulty, because Gerald is a saint, is not a common person. But that, however, proves that this whole system, like the post-Carolingian aristocracy was creating in Europe, was producing essentially the same results, whether from the monastic side, from the secular side. So it was like two faces of the same coin, in a certain measure. Naturally, the monastic side prevailed, because obviously it was much easier to become closer to God by living into a monastery. But this is also a matter of pride, because it's much more difficult in that sense and challenging to be pious and saints in a lay environment than it is to be in a monastery. Because monks closed themselves into monasteries essentially because they knew that there were temptations in the outside world that they would be, fearful of surrendering to. This guy instead chooses to live in the lay world as such. Now, I'm not an expert on this topic specifically of the Vita Sancti Geraldi, but it would be interesting to know from an expert, if you are one and you're listening to this video, which forms were prevalent. To me, they were kind of equal, but I think that from a strictly individual point of view, the lay side, the lay the lay experience in this fashion was harder in Odo's mind, because it required to be more exposed. So it's as if, and especially considering those earthly and secular values that the aristocracies had, it was in a certain sense saying that Gerald was better than a monk, than the average monk at least, as a saint. The others made it to be saints too. But this is just my speculation now. And at the same time, it's even interesting at a cognitive progress level, because a person who hears this story might say also something like, but yeah, maybe Odo was a bit, you know, morbid about his monastic life, so that to export it in the lay world because he was obsessed by his No, I don't think so. This is I don't think this is the right interpretation. On the contrary, I believe that Odo is proving here to be extremely open-minded, um, and to be extremely rich and open in his own culture and understanding of society. He was essentially proposing something new. He was challenging in many ways. We can assume that lots of people who read his work at that time would be even shocked by such a conception. And we have to admire Otto's perspective in this sense, because he's, after all, um, if you reflect about it, he was spreading a comforting message. Because usually, in a world like that was so dark and ugly and violent and miserable, and there was so much fear, uh, thinking that your Lord, so a person that truly lives within your world, can be a saint as well, is something that gives you a lot of hope. Because if you just think that saints belong are confined within the monastic walls, well, all you can say is, let me go into the monastic walls as well. But if you believe, if you give people hope to believe that even a layman can be a saint, and can still be a very good, hell of a layman, here being the prototype not only of the good Christian, but also of the good of the good secular Lord. Well, you're transmitting a great sense of positive uh, attitude within this society. So, um, and this is, I believe, typical also of Cluniac, of the Cluniac world in many ways. You know, in the same Cluniac reform there was the positivistic um, idea that even the same Benedictine rule could be reinterpreted successfully. So it was an important cognitive and intellectual achievement. It wasn't just taking passively Christian knowledge without thinking how to make it actively better in the actual world within the Christians. It was really saying, let's go ahead and think at something that can really make the world better in actual terms. And you have to think that the Cluniac order at this point is spreading extremely in power. The Cluniac monasticism at this time administered extremely vast riches that were increased incidentally by the lay donations. So this also meant that the laymen were, you know, kind of benedicted for and praised for all these donations that were increasing the same Cluniac patrimony. Um, and in many ways, the monastic order was fortifying itself behind those structures and clients that substantially were part of the same aristocratic, or were part of the same lay world in many ways, because building even a monastery in stone walls, as I was saying before, isn't it like creating a fortress? I mean, you can argue that whatever thing was built in those times in stone and as an enclosure to be de facto conceived also in military terms, because that is a fortification point, and it's a place where you can find shelter from which you can defend yourself. And don't you have clients like the aristocrats? It was plenty of clients, of people, of communities living into the monastic properties, and those depended from the monastery, and just like others would depend from the lay lords. So there was really a great, a great homogeneity within the European aristocracy at this time, whether it was lay or ecclesiastic. And they were also sharing at that point many values that could allow uh, um, um, a man like Odo, the most important reformer of Cluniac history, to accept that a layman like Gerald of Aurillac could be a perfect saint, just like a monk could and would aspire to become. So I hope the message was clear. Telling the truth, we made it quite simple. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert of this kind of literature, but I still find relevant and fascinating um, what these works really mean behind the surface. And this is what I urge you to do. When you read something that is history of any sort, always try to think not what it means to you that by living now, because it's senseless. I mean, you can learn something, but you can learn that something only if you reason in the terms that if you try at least to understand which were the terms into which those people reasoned for writing down that source. And that's what can really make you feel in awe, because yeah, that really is. It's moving in many ways. I personally am much more touched by such things than others. I'm very sensible towards literature. I don't know why I ended up to study the history of war. Um, I guess it's because it means to travel within the spectrum of human emotions in many ways. And you have to understand the whole life of these people, whether they were knights, whether they were monks, because that was really their world, and they couldn't exclude one another. Mm? Okay. So I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, if you did, I ask you to like it or to share it if you believe it's worth it of this. And otherwise, you can subscribe to my channel if you want to receive further contents. And as always, I thank you very much for listening. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.